Okay, ready when you are? Das heißt, wir sind online. Super. Now, the pointer doesn't work. Okay, now it works. It is very hard to find the right words, and I confess I do not have them. But I feel that we cannot possibly remain silent and not mention the horrors that are happening right now in Europe, only about 1,000 miles from here. Marina Abramovich has found words, and I wish to share them with you before we start. Okay, Till tells me that the sound, at least in this room, doesn't work. Maybe it works online for people who are joining us at home. No, some people are shaking their heads. So I hope you can read the subtitles. But never mind. This was Marina Abramovich on the horrors of the war. And I'm aware of how fortunate we are here, and probably the audience on screen at home is today to be able to engage peacefully and freely in academic discourse. And in solidarity with everyone suffering right now because of the war, let us keep this in mind throughout the workshop. There are initiatives from funding bodies right now, here for example by the Volkswagen Stiftung. And should you yourself be affected or know somebody who is, we copy the link into the chat. But now a very warm welcome to all of you here at Heinrich Heine University and also at home on screen to our conference on Proprioceptive Art. Great that you could all join us, you the speakers and also the audience. We have called this event a kick-off workshop, and here's what it means. We, a group of like-minded philosophers, together with students who have joined our Prop Art seminar, have started research on the significance of proprioception, the bodily senses in art. We have just begun, and so everything truly has a workshop character. If you, the speakers, as I will do, present work in progress, with open questions and loose ends, this is very welcome. We are very lucky to have won a great group of speakers, philosophers, art historians, psychologists. We have Jiří Binovský, we have Svetlana Černichova, Ksenia Fedorova, Corinna Kühnapfel, and I'm afraid to say Hanne Lorek had to cancel her talk on short notice. I'll refer to the program later, what we do instead in her slot. We have Juliane Zetsche, we have Charles Spence speaking, Ludger Schwarte, Markus Schrenk, that's me, by the way, and Barbara Montero. And now everyone is lined up in alphabetic order. Now these tiles you see here, and which some of you might know from Instagram and Twitter, are a good opportunity for me to introduce the group members to you. Because the tiles and the workshop poster have been designed by Julia Frese, who's sitting over there, and who is also responsible for the project's PR and the advertising. Till Bödecker has designed the typo on the tiles, which you also find on our website, which he also designed. And Till is also responsible for the sound and vision for the next 3 days here. Isabel Kessels has acquired the funding for this workshop and has, in general, been responsible for correspondences and background organization. And this is the point where I wish to thank our funding bodies. This is, on the one hand, the German Research Foundation, DFG, and the German Society for Analytic Philosophy, GAP. Thanks to them, to all of you at DFG and GAP for the funding for this workshop. Now finally, here's Juliane Zetsche, who has, for example, made possible the visit to K21, the museum we are going to visit this afternoon. And there's also in the background, but right now here in the conference room, Eva Kellner, our administrator, without whom nothing would be possible here. So thanks, Eva, for the background, all the background work. Now this is our program, which you will have seen online as well. Let me refer to it only briefly. We have registered already. We, at least here in the audience, had lunch. And this is my welcome note to you. Afterwards, I will give a short, brief introduction to what is proprioceptive art, or is proprioceptive art possible. We have a coffee break, and then the talk by Charles Spence, Proprioceptive Pleasures. Afterwards, everyone here joining us at Heinrich Heine University will go to the Museum K21 to visit Saraceno's Net. So be up for a proprioceptive experience in person. Afterwards, we have a conference dinner. We have a couple of spare places, so the speakers are invited, of course, but also for the audience. If you'd like to join us, ask the organizers, and we might be able to make a space possible for you at the restaurant. Now, as you know, this will also be streamed online right now on YouTube, and there are many of you already in Zoom joining us. Now, here's the Thursday program. Thursday sees a lot of talks, beginning with Jiří Binovský, Erotic Art as Proprioceptive Art, Ksenia Fedorova, Distributed Self, Artistic Tactics of Sensing Across and Beyond the Body Boundaries, all with lunch breaks and coffee breaks in between, Svetlana Chernyshova on Bodies in Motion and Activist Reflections on Art and its shifts in understanding the context of proprioception. Hanne, as I said, can't join us, unfortunately. We thought we keep the program as it is, especially for the online audience, so that there are no hiccups. But we open up Zoom for an open discussion. So this is an open discussion slot instead of Hanne Lorek's talk. And on that day, finally, Barbara, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to click her away. Barbara Montero will give her talk. Friday sees three further talks by Ludger Schwarte, Proprioception, Aesthetic versus Artistic Practice, then Juliane Zetsche on Proprioception in Visual Art, and finally Corinna Kühnapfel, Empirical Aesthetics for Installation Art. Now, of course, after every talk, we have Q&A sessions. For those of you who are in Zoom, please write a Q into the chat. Thereby, we know who asks which question at which point, and we keep the list in order. Please write a Q. If it's not possible for you to use your audio, then you, of course, can type your question, but we prefer here, the organizers, if you ask the question via your audio function. And people inside this room, just raise your hands as usual, of course. And by the way, the speakers and also the chairs and everyone who's asking a question in the audience, you may take off your mask, of course. Otherwise, during the workshop, please keep them on. Another exception is the lunch breaks and coffee breaks, of course. Oh, one point, I asked the chairs to be very strict with time organization. So if, in case they should not be able to take your question, please forgive us for chairing very strictly, because we want to keep the program in time for those of you who are joining us online. This is important to keep the timetable. Here's a note on COVID. So let me briefly remind you, people here inside the room, that we, the organizers, wish everyone attending that they are vaccinated, have received their booster shot, and please test yourselves daily as we all do. We ourselves won't check these very tight rules, but at the entrance of the building, you will be asked to show your pass or your negative test. Finally, as I said already, wear your mask throughout the workshop unless you are the speaker or the chair or you ask a question during the Q&A session. Now, if you have any questions regarding the program, please feel free to ask them now, here, or in the chat. And I hope I haven't forgotten anything. I look at the other organizers. Maybe you have something that I should mention as well. Well, in that case, I guess we can really start the workshop. Excellent. That gives me 2 minutes of a break because we start at 15 past. And I have some water in the meantime. Oh yeah, until you have to switch the slides, of course.
No, this is just for people in the room. So that you can be heard on Zoom, we will pass around a wireless microphone, which is in a sponge. So it doesn't make any noise when you touch it. So you will be handed the sponge, and you will just hand the sponge to the next person, and the microphone is in there. So don't be surprised by that.
And Till, did you switch on this microphone? You did. Excellent. Ah, great, good. Now, this short break gave me really the opportunity to look on screen and look who has joined us. So very welcome, everyone on screen. This is the first time I see you on the tiles. Great to see you online. Welcome. And now it's 15 past, so without further ado, I will start with the question, what is proprioceptive art? Now, intuitively, I guess, we have a clear sense of what visual arts are. Some paintings or photography are examples. Here's Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. We also have a clear intuition what auditory arts are. Here I have a picture of Thomas Ardès and Ian Bostridge performing the Winterreise by Schubert. And of course, there are intermediate cases of auditory arts and visual arts. Here is a picture of an opera by Philip Glass, his first opera, Einstein on the Beach, produced by Robert Wilson. So opera, ballet, dance performances, theater are intermediate cases. They would be categorizable under visual art and auditory art. And of course, there are such cases where paintings, visual art, induces bodily sensations. Here I have a picture by Bridget Relay, op art. It might induce nausea or vertigo when you look at these paintings, so bodily sensations. And one of our speakers, Juliane Zetsche, will target paintings like this, proprioception in visual art. We also have the case where auditory arts, music, include bodily sensations because they not only have hearable, audible sounds, but also subsonic sounds. So in techno music or in ambient drone music, this kind of music will target not only your ears, but also your stomach. So even in auditory arts or in visual arts, proprioceptions, the bodily senses, will be targeted, of course. But still, I think that we have clear cases of visual art and clear cases of auditory art. Or let me put it this way. Mona Lisa is clearly not a piece of music, is not an auditory art, and Schubert's Winterreise is clearly not visual art, to put it the other way around. Now, visual arts and auditory arts are not our interest, of course, here today. Our concern is proprioception, or quite generally, the bodily senses. And here is David Armstrong, from his book Bodily Sensations, giving us a couple of examples what we mean by bodily senses. We mean, by bodily sense, we perceive that our legs are moving, that our head is turned, that our arm is behind our back, that we are keeping our balance, that our body temperature is up, our ears cold, stomach distended, our gut full, our throat dry, our heart beating, our muscles tensed or relaxed. And he ends this quote, and all the other things that we discover about the current state of our body without recourse to sight, hearing, taste, smell, or touch. And these are the senses we are concerned with in this conference. But not only us, I mean, it would be kind of an autistic interior enterprise if only we were concerned with the bodily senses, but the whole art world is concerned with the bodily senses. Here are a couple of examples from recent years. Amanda Williams had an exhibition at MoMA, New York, called The Embodied Sensations. And this exhibition creates a shared understanding of what experiences are like through shared sensations or embodied experiences. Or here are slides at the Tate Modern by Carsten Höller. And Carsten Höller says on the Tate Modern website, the test site, the name of this artwork, isn't just in the turbine hall, but it is also, to an extent, in the slider, who is stimulated by the slides, a site within your body, you could add, we could add. And coming further to, Charles Spence, one of our speakers, will talk about Carsten Höller, I believe. And coming closer to home, there is our very own Till Bödecker with his artwork, Think Outside the Box. This is a sensory deprivation tank where you float in salty water and you are deprived of all the outer Aristotelian senses, and the only senses almost which are still triggered are your internal senses. So you're thrown back onto your own proprioceptions, onto your own bodily senses. So the art world is currently full of proprioceptive, what we are going to call proprioceptive art. But what is it? What is proprioceptive art? Now, here's an agenda for the rest of my talk. We have to be a bit clearer on what sense or what senses proprioception or the bodily senses are. Our main task will be to explicate what proprioceptive art is, and in passing, we will touch we will have some words on the concept of art in general, and also touch upon some ontological questions about art. And finally, we may discuss some open questions and observations we have made throughout. Now I start, of course, with one. We need to specify what sense proprioception is. Now here's something. We use the word proprioception referring to its Latin original, proprius, one's own, and recipere, to receive, as an umbrella term. So when we talk about prop art, we don't only talk about proprioception narrowly speaking, as psychologists or neuroscientists speak, but we mean everything of the three following perceptions. Proprioception narrowly conceived, interoception, and the vestibular system. Now, what are these three? Proprioception narrowly conceived is our perception of the position of our own limbs from inside, not by vision, of course, or our posture, our body's spatio-structural extension, our muscle tension. These are the perceptions which are called proprioception in the literature. And of course, to process the first four, we have to have a body image, a schema, this is necessary, a necessary precondition to correctly process information about the above. Now here's what interoception is. Interoception is the label for pains, itches, thermal sensations, sensations of orgasms, etc., or the properties of the viscera, so the respiratory, the gastrointestinal, the cardiovascular organs. The awareness of our energy and stress level, heartbeat, shortness of breath, indigestion, etc. So this is what bears the label interoception usually. And finally, the vestibular system located in our inner ear, that is the sense organ, which is your sense of equilibrium. It registers gravitation. Also, the spatial orientation of your body, mainly your head, and your movements, accelerations, or when you stop, is registered there in the vestibular system. And all these, proprioception, interoception, and the vestibular system, we have under the umbrella term, well, bodily sensations would have been a better term, but prop art is such a nice word that we decided to keep proprioception as the umbrella term, at least for the kind of art we are concerned with. Now you will have realized that bodily senses are no single organ. There must be multiple sensors for all these perceptions which I have listed beforehand. This is different from vision, where the eye is responsible for vision, and audition, where we have one single organ, namely the ear. Here we have a lot of sensors, evolved, of course, evolutionary evolved detector mechanisms that signal to the central nervous system. We have nociceptors, thermoceptors, osmoreceptors, etc., etc. So there are different organs, if we call these receptors organs. And also, there's a sensitivity to a range of different physical properties. For vision, we just have electromagnetic waves. For audition, it's sound waves. But here we have a range of physical properties that are detected: inertial motion, heat, pressure, change in tissue structure, chemicals, etc. But there is a unifying factor. But before I come to the unifying factor, all these detections, all these perceptions come with a very specific phenomenology. And of course, as it is somehow to see red, for example, it is somehow to feel a toothache, etc. So we have very specific phenomenologies linked to these kind of perceptions. Now, here's the unifying aspect. It all happens inside our body. Okay, that's the unifying factor. What is perceived or sensed are states and events within a very special physical object, and that object is your own body. Okay, that's the unifying factor. Now, having clarified what I mean by proprioception broadly speaking, we can now move on to proprioceptive art and define or explicate what that is. Now here's a finger exercise first. What is visual art? How would we define visual art as a finger exercise? Here again our example, Mona Lisa. Now if you were to wear noise-canceling headphones while looking at this picture, you would still perceive the painting, you would still perceive the artwork. It might disturb you, it might enhance your perception of the artwork, I don't know, but you would certainly not say, sorry, I can't perceive the artwork anymore. That's different when you're blindfolded. When you stand blindfoldedly in front of Mona Lisa, you cannot perceive the artwork anymore. Vision is essential to perceive the artwork. Without vision, this is not possible. So vision is, for visual arts, is somehow essential, and this is what I write into a tentative explication of visual art. This is really just finger exercise. Don't pinpoint me down on this definition, right? A work of art is a visual artwork if and only if seeing this work of art is essential for its proper appreciation. Okay, just as an intuition, shortcut. Same works for audition, of course, and maybe the same works for proprioceptive art. A work of art is prop art if and only if proprioceiving it, bodily sensing it, this work of art is essential for its proper appreciation. And I think this is not so bad, and we will end up with this definition again. But it takes some detours. It takes a long detour, and this is the main part of my talk. So here's the detour. It's a mouthful. Don't be worried. I explain each and every step of this tentative explication of prop art. Now, I just read it and then go through each and every line. Something X is the realization of a proprioceptive artwork if and only if X is a performance, an artifact, a participation, or a combination thereof, which, first, appeals essentially, indirectly or directly, to some degree or a lot, to its recipient's bodily senses. And that X, that something X, of course, has to qualify as a work of art. Otherwise, it's mere proprioception, but it's not a work of art. So it has to qualify as a work of art, or the long version, by some preferred art theory, the realization, it has to be a realization of a work of art. Okay, now, as you will have seen, there are a lot of footnotes on this tentative explication, and here's what these footnotes mean. I start with qualifies by some preferred art theory as a realization of a work of art. So, by some preferred art theory. And this is where, by the way, here's my agenda again. This is, by the way, where we say something about the concept of art in general. But what I will do today is I will outsource the problem, okay? I simply adopt as a working hypothesis institutionalism as a theory of art. What does institutionalism say? Institutionalism says this: a work of art is an artifact, a performance, participation, etc., upon which some society or some subgroup of a society, that could be curators, galleries, museums, art critics, etc., who have conferred the status of candidate for appreciation to that piece of work, to this artifact. Okay. Now, if that happens, 1 and 2, if it's an artifact and some society, some gallery, let's say, has conferred the status of candidate for appreciation on it, then it counts as a work of art. Now, mind you, this is my working hypothesis is institutionalism. We could argue for other theories of art and implement them here. But I outsource the problem and don't define together proprioceptive art. I define art, and then I define what would make it proprioceptive art. Okay? So I think when we want to define proprioceptive art, we can outsource this problem. And my choice was institutionalism. By the way, here put forward by Dicky, but Ludger Schwarte, who will give a talk on Friday and is in the audience, is a proponent of institutionalism, at least some kind of, Ludger, you will correct me if this is not right, but I believe so. Now, tentative explication, where are we? I said something about our concept of art. Now let me talk about ontology. What kind of entity is a work of art? So I'm looking at this first line, realization of a proprioceptive artwork. Why do I say this? So here are ontological questions. Now again, I will adopt a working hypothesis, outsource the problem again. But before I come to this working hypothesis, let me point this out. There seem to be works of art, paintings, sculptures, etc., that belong to the realm of spatio-temporal material things. One would think that Mona Lisa, as it hangs in the Louvre, is the work of art, that very painting. It's natural to think that. Other artworks, like music or literature, are more likely to be abstract arts. These works live as Platonic ideas, but they can be realized in concrete concerts or in concrete performances or in concrete prints, books. They can be realized there. But they can be multiply realized, and so it is it is intuitive to say they are like types and they can be tokened a couple of times. Now, you can put forward this kind of dualism, okay, and say that different artworks belong to different ontological categories, but there are also monisms, and I will adopt abstract monism, which says that even paintings are abstract. Well, the artwork is abstract, and a painting is just an exemplar, is a realization of that kind of artwork. We can go into that during the Q&A sessions, but again, I would like to adopt abstract monism as the theory, the ontological theory behind my definition of proprioceptive art. It has been put forward, for example, by Greg Curry, who might be in the audience as well, and Maria Reicher, from whom I copied this bibliography. Okay, further on this abstract monism, which says that any artwork is an abstract thing and it can be realized in physical things or in performances, in concerts, etc. As I said, I want to outsource this problem. I said that already. And here's my reason for adopting that kind of ontological theory. The reason is, quite generally, ontological parsimony and unity. We just have one type of entity, which is an artwork. Okay? But here's a more specific reason. Prop art comes in many artistic forms. Realizations can be installations. We will visit Saraceno's Net this afternoon. I think that is a proprioceptive artwork. And it's realized, one exemplar, one realization is in the K21. But other proprioceptive artworks are realized in performances or as participations, etc. And I think that Svetlana will focus on these many different kinds of proprioceptive artworks. At least this is what I have taken from her abstract. Now here's another reason why abstract monism is attractive for my definition, because we can then speak of author-intended realization conditions of artworks. Artworks are abstract objects, they have to be realized somehow, and the artist, the author of the artwork, can also decide how they are to be realized. So Leonardo certainly did not think that Mona Lisa has to be realized in sound, but as oil on canvas so that it can be seen. So the realization conditions, the intended realization conditions, can be inscribed into the abstract entity, and thereby we have reference to senses that are intended to be affected by the realization of the artwork. So that is an advantage for my story about proprioceptive art. So what I will say is that to be works of proprioceptive art, their proper realization must involve or affect the bodily senses. This is a short version. Okay, final line when it comes to my tentative explication. I say that essentially, directly or indirectly, to some degree, it has to target the recipient's bodily senses. Okay, what do I mean by essentially? Well, as with our finger exercise for visual art, the visual senses, our eyes, have to be involved essentially, and that's the same here. The artwork, well, it belongs to the adequate realization conditions of the artwork that its realizations affect the recipient's bodily senses. Or put in counterfactual form, if we were to take away the according bodily sensations, we would not perceive a crucial part of, hence essentially, of the realization of that artwork. Okay? If you stand blindfoldedly in front of Mona Lisa, you don't see the artwork. You can appreciate it, of course, by thinking about Mona Lisa or talking about Mona Lisa, but you can't appreciate the artwork with the intended sense. And that is the case for proprioceptive art with proprioceptions. If you were to take them away, the bodily senses, you would not perceive a crucial part of it. So that is what I mean by essentially. Now, who's the authority? Who says what is essential when we look at an artwork? And again, I outsource this problem, and I adopt as a working hypothesis author intentionalism. Who's the authority? what kind of artwork it is, which senses should be triggered by the realization. Well, the artist, of course. Who else? Well, who else? Here are alternatives. The recipients could decide. You, the audience, could decide. You could decide Mona Lisa is a wonderful auditory piece. I always go visit the Louvre to hear other people talk about Mona Lisa. That's the greatest artistic part about Mona Lisa. Fair enough, you can do so. But was this intended by Leonardo da Vinci? Probably not. The author's intention is that it has to be seen, this artwork. Also, art critics could be the people who decide, etc. But I believe that author intentionalism has a point to it. Maybe a note in brackets at this point, which is important, which I haven't got on the slides. Art is not a natural kind. Defining what gold is, or what a quark is, or an electron, there you might find necessary and sufficient conditions for natural kinds. I believe there are natural kinds, but this is a different issue, and those you can define. Artworks are socially constructed entities to a high degree, so it's up to us to make definitions, and they should be practically useful. And I believe that this, go for author intentionalism, is the most useful thing to do here. I'm not claiming that I have seen the Platonic idea of what art is and who the author is. There's no discovery here I claim to have made. It's just claiming, look, if we go for this thesis, other things work out well. So that's my general tendency when it comes to defining art or defining proprioceptive art. Right? It's just a pragmatical, to a huge degree, it's a pragmatical choice. Okay, what do I mean by indirectly or directly? I believe that art can be both, directly and indirectly proprioceptive. Here's an example. I'll leave that aside. When adequately engaging with Höller's slides, that is, by sliding down the slides yourself, we directly proprioceive and interoceive, and our vestibular system registers that we are kind of falling when sliding down the slides. So sliding down the slides affects immediately, directly, your proprioceptive senses, your muscles, tension, your interoceptive senses, maybe heat because of the friction, and also the vestibular system, directly. Release op art, which I had as an example for visual art, triggering proprioceptions, might be an indirect proprioceptive artwork because vision mediates the proprioceptions. So if it triggers vertigo in you or nausea, then these are bodily sensations which are triggered by vision. So that would be, and if it is essential, if Bridget really wanted those proprioceptions to be caused, then it's also a proprioceptive artwork. It's of course also a visual artwork, right? These categorizations are not one and only categorizations. You might cross-categorize. So op art might be predominantly visual art, but also proprioceptive art. Okay. Here's another kind of indirect proprioception, the firing of mirror neurons while watching, for example, dance. Right? If you're not the dancer yourself, but you're watching dancers, have danced yourself maybe previously, have some experience, then your mirror neurons will fire and will give you indirect proprioceptions as well. Okay, I have talked about this already. It has to be essential, even if it's indirect, it has to be essential. Otherwise, it's no proprioceptive art. If it's just a byproduct, an accidental byproduct, as I would think that the noises other museums visitors make while looking at Mona Lisa. That's an accidental auditory input. It doesn't belong essentially to that visual kind of artwork. Now, what do I mean by some degree? Actually, I don't only mean by some degree, but here's a huge spectrum. I believe that art can be all that. To some degree, very much, predominantly, and maybe even only proprioceptive. So this is a spectrum. It is just important that essentially, it is to some degree proprioceptive. If it's not proprioceptive art. So some degree has to be implemented, but then it can be all that, very much predominantly, maybe even only proprioceptive, no other senses involved. Maybe such artworks exist. Höller's slides are maybe predominantly and directly prop art, while Wheeler's paintings are only to some degree and only indirectly prop art. So these are attributes, direct, indirect, and the degree are attributes that can be attributed to proprioceptive art. The essential part is the essential part. Okay, this is what I say here, that it's essentially that some bodily senses are involved. Okay, so having gone through all this, these parameters, we can have an abbreviated explication. An artwork X is a proprioceptive artwork if and only if. And note, I have outsourced the problem of defining art already. I say now, an artwork X, it's already agreed it's an artwork. It's in a museum, okay? It's already there. We agree it's an artwork. And it is a proprioceptive artwork if and only if it appeals essentially to its recipient's bodily senses. So without having triggered your bodily senses, you don't perceive a crucial part, an essential part of the artwork. And as I said, that might be directly or indirectly, and it might come in degrees, mainly, predominantly, only. And in the background, we have accepted institutionalism in saying what artworks are, which entities X belong to the realm of artworks. We have adopted author intentionalism. Who is to say which perceptions are essential, which senses? Well, the artist is. And I have adopted ontic abstract monism, which says that artworks are abstract objects being realized in concrete objects or being realized in performances, in concerts, etc. Okay. Now all this is tentative still. I welcome your counterexamples and I welcome your suggestions to make that explication or definition better. Now, do I have time for open questions? I don't, I'm afraid, but here are some examples I wanted to consider. This is the Nat we are going to visit. It's in a museum, so it is art by institutionalism. Is it essentially proprioceptive? Well, we would have to ask Saraceno, of course, sorry, this means that I still have 30 minutes. Oh yeah, of course.
We are at 30 minutes now. And
excellent, I started at 15:15.
exactly.
Wonderful. Okay, I've got time. We already established this is art. The net, which we are going to visit, is art because it's an object for appreciation in a museum. Is it proprioceptive art? We would have to ask the artist, Saraceno, whether he intends that something bodily is going on essentially. And I guess he would not deny this. Just looking at the net, you see part of the artwork. You perceive part of the artwork, but not the full thing. You have to experience it yourself. You have to go and walk into the net to see the full thing. So it might be partially also visual art, okay? But for it to be proprioceptive art, it is necessary to walk into the net yourself. Or here is The White Bouncy Castle by Dana Kaspersen, William Forsythe, and Joel Ryan, Deichtorhallen, Hamburg. Again, institutionalism, okay, it's a museum, and you are supposed to jump on this bouncy castle as the audience and not just look at it. So you are supposed to experience your body, how your muscles, stomach, core body muscles must be tensed in order not to topple over. It will trigger your vestibular system, etc. And as a final example for proprioception, dance. And dance is, of course, in the institutions. But here it is important, unless you focus on mirror neurons, that you are the dancer yourself. Okay? And this is what Barbara Montero has focused a lot on. Here, this is her old talk title. It has changed, but proprioceptive art of choreography. When you are at least when you are the dancer yourself, then dance is a proprioceptive, or can be a proprioceptive artwork. So these were examples for that class of artworks. Now, we discuss open questions and observations, and I do have time because I thought I had started at 1 o'clock. Okay, here's a problem I have with my definition. The problem of emotions. Emotions are not problematic, or some are, but here's my problem with emotions. Any kind of artwork might, author intentionally and essentially, provoke emotions: joy, pleasure, disgust, fear, etc. Now, emotions are or cause bodily reactions. That depends on your theory of emotions, but they are or cause bodily reactions and thereby proprioceptions, interoceptions. Vestibular system, maybe, is triggered by emotions. But then, any kind of artwork might intentionally, essentially, indirectly, via the emotion it causes, and to some degree, invoke bodily sensations. And if so, all art is proprioceptive art. It's a slippery slope. Almost any artwork is proprioceptive artwork. And how can we avoid this? Why would I want to avoid this? Well, if everything is proprioceptive art, then the notion of proprioceptive art doesn't have any bite anymore. So I think it would be better if we could somehow bracket emotions. We might just say, we might do that in saying, indirect is okay, indirect proprioception, except for emotions. That might be a very ad hoc move to make. Here's the ad hoc solution. Or just say, we exclude, after all indirect proprioceptions. An artwork is only proprioceptive if the proprioceptive bodily senses are directly triggered. That would be a solution. But I don't know whether it's a good solution. Or concede that almost every artwork is indirectly a proprioceptive artwork, and be concerned only with direct prop art as a subject of investigation. That would be a possibility too. But maybe you have some further ideas how to deal with that problem. Now, when we focus on proprioceptive art, let's say on direct, predominant proprioceptive art, the question arises, why is there now such a focus on these arts? If I'm correct to categorize the net, Saraceno's net, and Höller's slides, and the embodied sensations exhibition, etc., if I'm correct to categorize this as proprioceptive art, why now? Why does this happen now? And why have vision and audition have such a predominance in art? Why is that so? So in our daily lives and the art world, the sense of sight and sound has been primarily appealed to. So why has this been so, would be the question. And yet the art world, the inclusion of proprioceptive elements is currently en vogue. Why is this so now, is an interesting question to ask. And empirical studies might help here. So Corinna Kühnapfel, with her talk, Empirical Aesthetics for Installation Art, has also empirical studies on that kind of artwork. So that might help us to understand why now, or what people think of proprioceptive art. Demarcation could be a problem. Is architecture proprioceptive art? After all, you are guided through a building by where the stairs are located, where the entrances are, etc. Could massage be proprioceptive art? And I think, yes, sure, both. I mean, look at institutionalism again. If it is within a museum's context, why not? And also, I said, it can be on a spectrum to some degree or predominantly proprioceptive. So architecture is to some degree proprioceptive, and massage might well be predominantly an artwork if it is performed in museums, or like Jiří Binovský will talk about erotic art as proprioceptive art, which is probably predominantly proprioceptive. Now, our self-image. We are talking about bodily senses, and the lived, embodied experience of being in the world is crucially a proprioceptive experience. Being in the world is a bodily exercise. And so the bodily senses are central to this feeling of being in the world. And thus, proprioceptive artworks might therefore be uniquely suitable to shake our self-image and stretch the boundaries for our concepts of ourselves. So, when you might ask yourself the following question. We are much better trained to speak about our visions, and visual art can be, that's an intuition, can be much more complex than proprioceptive artworks. Now, even if that is the case, there is space for proprioceptive art because it can target our self-image, stretch the boundaries for our concept of self. So there is intuitively also a great space for proprioceptive art. And in her talk, Distributed Self, Artistic Tactics for Sensing Across and Beyond the Bodily Boundaries, Ksenia Fedorova will talk about these extensions of the self in artworks. Now, I do have even time to talk about something, about the peculiar privacy of the bodily senses. Now, you might think that the bodily senses, and you would be right, you might think that the bodily senses are more private than other senses are. But we have to be careful. Your visual sensation, I can't have your visual sensations either. And I can't have your auditory sensations either. So what you hear when you listen to Winterreise, or what you see when you see Mona Lisa, is also private to you. So the bodily senses are no exception in this respect. But there is a privacy to the bodily senses, a peculiar privacy. And David Armstrong makes it fairly clear what it is. There is a peculiarity of bodily perception. The objects of this sense are private to each perceiver. Nothing mysterious is meant by this. Attention is simply being called to the fact that bodily perception informs each of us of what is going on in his body and nobody else's. Our fields of view can overlap. We can hear the same sound, smell the same smell, taste and touch the same object. But I cannot feel the motion of your limbs or the distensions of your stomach by my bodily perceptions. So that is the privacy of the bodily senses, but not that your sensations, empirically speaking, are private. This is no difference for vision and audition. Okay, in respect of this sense, we really are locked up inside our bodies. Or to put it in a more cheerful way, we have a privileged access to information about our own body, namely also from inside and not only from outside. You can touch other bodies, you can see other bodies, but you cannot proprioceive other bodies. Okay, I think this is what I say there. Oh, and surprisingly for myself, I'm at the end of my talk already. These are the sources of the pictures I have used, and now I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, many thanks, Marcus, for your great talk. We have already a couple of questions lined up in the chat. I'd like to remind you again, please just put in a queue, don't use the raised hand function, and please for further sessions, also just wait till we are at the point of the discussion before posting your questions. It's just a bit easier for us to keep track like that. But yeah, so I will give the floor to Julie Binovsky, who had a couple of questions right away.
Okay, Julie, we can't hear you yet. Just a second.
You will have to wait a moment. I think we have a technical issue.
Do the Zoom participants hear Jiri already? Yeah, okay. Okay, it's just us here in the room. Sorry for this.
Okay, I think in that case we will put you back for a second and give Till the chance to figure out what's going on. So do we have any questions in the room? I think Xenia was the first. I will give the microphone to you now, and then I will ask you to pass it around.
Yes, well, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Marcus, for this introductory lecture that indeed helps to situate us, right? And I really appreciate also the philosophical approach to the topic. And so building up further, so on the rhetoric, right, and the topic you picked for this first talk, what is proprioceptive art? I'd like to ask how could we consider the other types of questions about proprioceptive art, and first of all, why proprioceptive art?
Why proprioceptive art? Well, there could be an autobiographic answer to that, and there could be a philosophical answer to, or an arty answer to that. I think I go for the official philosophial and art answer, and spare you the autobiography. There's time at dinner for that. Well, it's just it was my observation that proprioception, all the bodily senses, enter into the art world. Of course, we had that beforehand. First of all, in visual arts, we will learn from Juliana later that visual art already was meant to trigger proprioceptions. So it has been the case in the background all the time, of course. And in the 60s, with fluxes and happening art, our bodies were involved in art already. But I think it has a new quality nowadays, in the last decade or in the last 20, maybe 25 years, where we are not only participants and thereby the material of the artwork, just some bodies of recipients, of museum goers, are also the material integrated into the artwork. But the switch is that we shall be aware really of what is going on in our bodies inside. So the view from inside is now on proprioception. And this is just an observation that this is the case. On our website we have many more examples of that, or also in art schools. You can see that students present their masterpieces, which are proprioceptive pieces. You have slides there as well, or ropes from where you can swing through the room, etc. So it's just the observation that it's happening, and I thought that a theoretical approach to it might be useful and also interesting. So this is the genesis of the question.
So, as far as I know, sadly, we still won't be able to hear you, Jiri, but luckily you did write out your question, even though I did not recommend that, so that gives me the chance to read it out, and I will try to do that now. So, Jiri's question is proprioception one sense, in brackets one sense modality, namely the sense of feeling one's own body, or is it a bunch of different senses corresponding to the different types of information we get, as you explained, which concern the same object, our body? And is there a technological, is there a terminological issue, or is it a substantial issue? What do you think?
I would guess that you could make further differentiations. You could speak about interoceptive art, vestibular systems art, and proprioceptive art, narrowly speaking. I think you could do that. So it is, the bodily senses are truly a bunch of different senses, or at least you have different receptors. And so you could be even more fine-grained and ask the question, is there thermoceptor art, which just triggers your thermoceptions? Could be. But I think that these senses are, that would be too fine-grained. And so my belief is that having bodily senses, and the unifying factor is that it's information about what is going on inside our skin. This being the unifying factor, And this is broad enough and fine-grained enough to talk about a new category of art next to visual art and auditory art. To go more fine-grained is possible, but I think thermal art or pain art is just too small to be complex enough. That would be my hunch, that this is so.
I just heard that, or Till said that it should work now, and Jiri has actually a second question just lined up. So let's give it another try. Fingers crossed. No, sadly no. And we have someone else on the list, Elisa, but you just gave us a cue. So I will first read out Jiri's second question now. And Elisa, please, sorry, we will have to ask you to type your question. Hopefully in the coffee break we figure out how to have you, so that we can hear you here as well. But okay, I will now read out Jiri's second question.
Oh, one possibility is just to switch on the sound on my computer, and maybe that is loud enough. Just had this idea.
Okay.
So it should work on this computer. So who's next?
Oh, okay, then we take Jiri's question.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. Sorry, I think I have to switch off the sound on my computer again. Sorry for this hiccups. Thanks for this question, it's very important. I used to think about the net or the slides in that I formulate the following metaphor. The slides or the nets are like instruments who make it sound proprioceptively in our bodies. So with this metaphor, indeed, the net or the slides, the installations, wouldn't be the artwork, but they are the instruments. Or think of film, the old, not digital film, but film rolls, reels. They are the material that can make, that can cause visions. And the same with a net. The net could be like a film roll, a reel, like that. That's what I used to think. But I think that, the visual artwork, Mona Lisa, is also oil on canvas. It's a material thing. It is not vision itself. So also there is some interaction going on. But still we would call Mona Lisa the realization of the artwork. And so I'm not sure anymore how to talk about the installations. I could conceive of artworks as being, realizations of artworks can be two things, and at the same time, physical entities and mental entities. So they could live in two ontological realms, the realizations of artworks. That would be an opportunity. Maria Reicher has this approach, for example, where it can be both. But Jiri, thanks for this question. It's one of the very important follow-up questions, what the installation is. Does it belong to the realization of the artwork, or is it the instrument which causes the proprioceptions in us? I'm not sure on that yet, but thank you.
Okay, next we have Elisa Calderola, and I will just try to take care of the sound and do the same. Just put put this on max. Okay, could you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I was typing the answer, the question anyway. It's good that you can hear me. So thanks for the great talk. My question is actually related to the last question we heard. And so it seems to me that from what you said, we can conceive of prop art as what some philosophers of art would call an art genre more than an art form. An art genre being a category that can encompass works in different art media, like for instance, works of installation art, works of architecture, what we could call maybe first-person performances, like works where we ourselves, the public, are asked to dance, etc. And so in this sense, the category of proprioceptive art would be similar to, say, the category of comedy that can encompass movies and novels and theater plays, etc. And I think, so if you agree with this point, this perhaps might help you finding a solution for your first problem.
Sorry,
the
to interrupt.
problem-
I have to repeat the question for the audience here because it was only me who could hear you. So give me
sorry, I didn't get that. So I'll stop here.
It turns out that my laptop speaker is much lower volume if you
it's
put
a
it to
hybrid-
the max. So yeah,
conference, so
but
this
Marcus
is-
will repeat your question so that everyone knows.
Yeah, so the idea is great. The idea was to say it's not an art form, but it's an art genre. Proprioceptive art could be an art genre. For the reason that it can be, as far as I understood the question, I hope I understood it correctly, because it is so realizable in so many different media forms, as in performances, participations, or in installations, etc. It might be better to call it a genre rather than an art form. Is this what? Did I correctly understand your question? And thanks for this question. I don't have an answer yet, but it makes me think about it. Genre versus art form, and I have to do some follow-up reading on this difference. So thanks a lot for this question. Now,
Should we take the follow-up on
we
because
take
we
the
don't have
follow-up.
anyone else on the list so
I
far.
think there are some people in the audience here
Oh,
as
really?
well.
Sorry, did I miss you?
But let's have the follow-up and then Charles. Okay. Now, I try again. My own notebook, which seems to be louder. You may go for your follow-up.
May I? Okay, sorry. So what I wanted to add is that if you think of proprioceptive art in terms of an art genre, this might perhaps help you solve the emotions problem you mentioned at some point, because you might perhaps simply claim that, since proprioceptive art is an art genre, it might be that to some degree, works in a wide variety of genres have a certain degree of proprioceptive character to them. And then what is relevant is really how significant this degree is. One could write a novel whose main field is pretty tragic and still have, limited comedic episodes within it. And perhaps you could have, I don't know, a painting that has a limited proprioceptive dimension to it. And I think, this is an analogy that could help you solve that issue, perhaps. Okay. And then there's other stuff concerning the ontology of artworks, but there's no related to the art form, art genre distinction, but there's no time.
I think we will have to leave it at that.
Okay.
So, Marcus, the chance to answer, please.
Okay, many thanks again So I have always to switch off the sound first because of the echo here in the room. So many thanks for your suggestions. I will really think about calling it a genre, and that might solve also the problem with emotions. So yeah, thanks for the material to think about. Great, thank you.
Okay, then we come to Charles now.
So I'm not sure I've got an entirely well-formulated question, but I'll give it a go. Taking up on your suggestion, well, we know visual art when we see it. We wouldn't be able to appreciate the Mona Lisa with our eyes closed, at least not as the author intended it. And then I sort of wondered what would happen if you put color music in the Mona Lisa's place as sort of paintings or light shows that were intended to trigger hearing or sound. In that case, is that still a visual artwork? Or if you didn't have your hearing, would you appreciate the work as the artist intended? So that leaves me thinking that maybe, as well as for proprioceptive art to be intended by the author, that proprioception is stimulated directly or indirectly, it's also the case that it needs to be effective, that they succeed in their goal. It's not enough just to intend it to be the case, but they actually have to deliver, at least in some of the experiencers.
Okay, that's interesting. Is success necessary? Well, I don't know the answer, but let me improvise. Suppose Leonardo has a second version of Mona Lisa, but never intended to show it to anyone. I mean, wasn't sure about it, stored it in the cellar, and as a matter of fact, never showed it to anyone and burned it at one point. Now, was it a visual artwork or not? And I think it was, even if it didn't succeed to trigger any vision, simply because he took it back, but he primarily, first of all, he intended it to be a visual artwork. So I would think that success, I mean, it's best if there is success, but it's not necessary. I wouldn't inscribe it into the definition that there is success. Now for your light show or with light and sound, as I said, it's visual art, auditory art, proprioceptive art, smell, taste art, etc. These are not categories which are exclusive. So one and the same artwork can be all of that at the same time. If the relevant components are essential to appreciate that artwork. That is always the important bit, not accidental smells or so. They have to be intended, right? So your visual auditory piece would be both. It would be an auditory and a visual piece, and maybe also to a degree a proprioceptive piece, if it does not only happen accidentally that there are proprioceptions, but if they are intended by the author.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for discussion.
Oh,
so let's thank our speaker again. And
thank you. Thanks for the question.
And now we have a 15-minute break in which we hopefully figure out how to solve the audio problem. And everyone here is, of course, invited to go on with the discussion or get a coffee. And yeah, we'll see each other at past.
Now it should work.
And blue means it's switched on already. Okay, excellent. Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Charles Spence, a world-famous experimental psychologist with a specialization in neuroscience-inspired multisensory design. In 1997, he established the Cross-Modal Research Lab at the Department of Experimental Psychology at Oxford University. And he has since worked with many of the world's largest companies across the globe. Much of his work focuses on the design of enhanced multisensory food and drink experiences, leading him to collaborate with chefs, baristas, mixologists, chocolatiers, etc., and the food and beverage and flavor and fragrance industries. Another question he's worked on extensively is how technology will transform our dining and drinking experiences in the future. Today, Charles will talk to us on how proprioceptive pleasures can enrich our aesthetic experiences. Charles, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be here virtually and in person at the same time. And to... Can you switch your microphone? And to share with you some of the multisensory perspective. I come as an experimental psychologist, not as a philosopher or a practicing artist, and also with sort of a personal interest.
Here we go.
There we go. With a sort of personal interest in proprioceptive pleasures. My background is in multisensory perceptions, how all the senses integrate one with another to affect our experience and our memories, very much in the world of food and drink, but also increasingly in the world of entertainment as well, and that's kind of the theme for today. Thinking back a bit about proprioceptive pleasures and this sort of transition from proprioceptive entertainments, kinesthetic thrills, that have been a signature feature of the fairground and pleasure park for a century or more now, and how and what changes when they transition into the gallery space. And I guess we've had already, so I don't need to say much more on the sort of distinction between the various bodily senses, the proprioception, kinesthesis. I might add to the list, wasn't mentioned last time, the sort of the feeling of our body in motion, as well as the vestibular senses. And probably in any experience that engages some or all of those, proprioception, where our body is, kinesthesis, our feeling of it moving, and vestibular, of the position of our body in space, it will also likely involve somatosensation too, the feeling of the skin being pressured or pushed as we feel ourselves flung out and around and about. So really maybe 4 bodily senses there before we get to any of those interoceptive ones that were mentioned earlier. But beyond those bodily senses, I think there's a sort of sense that these senses interact. So when thinking about proprioception, it is sort of fundamentally a multisensory experience. On one level, just probably integrating kinesthesis, vestibular, and quite likely also somatosensory input. But very often, and practically speaking, it will also engage and be influenced by the other senses, such as sight, which might lead, as in the op art, to us perhaps feeling sick, as was mentioned. And that was indeed, I think, the response of some of those who used to travel on this illusion, the haunted swing illusion, patented, I think, about 1890-something, and written about in the psychology journals in 1904 from the California State Fair. People enter the room, they sit on this sort of swing, and that sort of starts to swing back and forth, so stimulating, I guess, vestibular, perhaps kinesthetic senses, somatosensation too. And then at some point, the room itself starts to spin, so you're only swinging back and forth, and you have the illusion that you're swinging 360 degrees, when in fact you are not. So this is a proprioceptive bodily entertainment, we might call it. If we put it in an art gallery, I suppose we have to call it prop art, though I'm not sure anyone has put this particular illusion there as yet. But the key point that this, our senses do not exist in isolation. They are always, our perception, the result of multisensory integration, be that just within the bodily senses, but more often the integration of the bodily senses with the external or the distal senses of hearing, vision, and perhaps even smell, who knows, as well. And I'll come back to some quotes on that later on as people try and describe their experience of proprioceptive pleasures in the context of the theme park. And these slides have been mentioned already by Marcus, Carsten Holler's, which were exhibited in a number of venues now, I think 11 or 13 different galleries, museum spaces, including the Tate Modern in 2006. And as part of the experience at the new... Are you changing this? Or? As part of experience at the new Museum of Contemporary Art in New York in 2011, a collection of Holler's various proprioceptive and experiential works over the years, which created a lot of press interest, some of which I'll come back to a little later. And because this does, in Marcus's term, I guess, either directly stimulate proprioception and kinesthesis through you being in the slide, sliding through and down, or I guess Holler also talks about you seeing other people. That's part of the reason for them to be transparent, that the viewers on the bottom of the turbine hall can see those who are having their bodies transformed through motion. And I want to think about this and say, is it necessarily art, proprioceptive or otherwise? And what does it have to do to really to go beyond this same phenomenon or experience outside the context of the art gallery? And a number of Carsten Holler's works either just represent traditional fairground rides in the context of an art gallery, and or represent psychological illusions that we study in the laboratory, put them in an art gallery and call it art. And it feels like one might need to do more for that, both because I could come as an experimental psychologist studying some of these illusions in the laboratory and never thought of them as art, proprioceptive or otherwise, and also because what we see here, the helter-skelter, perhaps the inspiration for Carsten Holler's slides, this kind of, what does helter-skelter mean? Adverb meaning in confused, disorderly haste. And one of these helter-skelters used to sit on our mantelpiece at home, because my parents grew up on the fairground and would sort of do rides such as this. So sort of family interest as well as a professional interest in taking these proprioceptive and kinesthetic entertainments and illusions from the lab and the fairground into the gallery. As far as I can tell, the first person to think about propelling people in this sort of chaotic, disorderly haste through helter-skelters is about 1903 over in Coney Island in New York. And the earliest date I can get in the UK to about 1905, 1906, so quite a long history. The same thing is probably also true for one of Carsten Holler's other proprioceptive art works, experiential art works, the Mirror Carousel from 2005 that was also shown at the Experience exhibit in New York in 2011. This, another kind of classic fairground ride that goes back even further to about 1860s and before and again has just been repositioned into an art gallery, and so perhaps becomes proprioceptive art in so doing. Both for those who are encouraged to sit on the very slow-moving carousel, but also in his interviews, Holler suggests it's just those who are viewing others whose bodies are in movement. That is part of the experience, so indirect proprioception, perhaps one might call it. But I'm just wondering, is that all that we need to make these fairground rides into art, simply where they are displayed, or the intention of the artist placing them there? And we have had already, I guess, the institutional view that if it's in an art gallery, well, that's good enough for many to call it art, and these exhibits are in a number of art galleries and spaces, and hence they do fulfill some of the criteria, but such as in the Tate Modern and in New York, but probably that they stimulate proprioception, and that occurs in the context of an art gallery is not sufficient. And that was brought home to me just from this exhibit I saw 2 weeks ago now in New York, Trust with Fuse, sort of information technology. You're in a cube with projections on the wall, the ceiling, and on the floor, with some sort of ambient music in the background, and you'll sit there for half an hour as the artists collective involved tries to translate the notions of data and security into visuals and sound effects and such like. And as part of that, with this sort of quite immersive space, at some points the kind of the ground or horizon that's projected on the wall sort of tilts, and I was just sort of sitting and standing there going, suddenly I had a lot of proprioceptive awareness. Is the room really moving, or is it just what's on the walls? But this, I think, is an example. It is sort of proprioceptive. It did stimulate my proprioceptive senses, self-awareness of body and its position in space, but I don't think it was deliberate or intentional. That was an incidental consequence of the exhibit, and not necessary to, I think, enjoy it, or perhaps not even thought about by the collective who put this together. So that wouldn't count as proprioceptive art, even though it was in the context of an art gallery, and it did stimulate my, and I presume others, proprioceptive senses. So then we might just put that together to, in a sense, concur with Marcus that proprioceptive art must have that proprioceptive kinesthetic and or vestibular component. It helps certainly if it is in the context of an art gallery or exhibition space. I think this proprioceptive element needs to be intentionally foregrounded in the viewer's experience. And I'll come back to this question of whether it's enough for the artist to intend to stimulate proprioception, or whether the receiver, me or you, needs to be aware of that intention or experience the result. And I think maybe might be more important than was suggested, but we'll see. And then finally, as Marcus mentioned, and I think we'll hear more about later, the question of vicarious awareness of body through our experience of dance and performance is sort of something we've written a bit about, linking into the mirror neuron system, but not one I really want to pursue any further here. I focus primarily on that sort of first-person perspective of the viewer sliding down the slide rather than looking at others doing things. But we might ask, okay, so we have these works that, for argument's sake, are in the art gallery and that do intentionally stimulate proprioception and or the other bodily senses that we lump together. But would we necessarily want to call it an aesthetic experience in sort of Kant's notion of it being disinterested? Might be another way to press our definitions, I think. And this is something I've used more often in the context of food, to say whether we can have can food be art? And sort of building on Kant's suggestion in his Critique of Judgment that aesthetic judgments are characterized by three key features: their subjectivity, their disinterested nature, and their claim of universality. Similarly, in their review of the scientific literature on visual aesthetics, Palmer and colleagues argue that aesthetic judgments are disinterested in the sense that they do not involve desire. Hence, in the context of food, preferring a large to a small piece of cake would not count as an aesthetic judgment because you can't really make that judgment without reference to the self and your desire to eat the larger piece of cake. So in this case, gastroporn is not kind of an aesthetic, or food is not art, and can't be. And I also wonder whether the same thing could use the same argument about disinterested in the context of proprioceptive experience, proprioceptive artworks, to say there too very often it might not be possible to take a disinterested stance if you are the one sliding down the slide on the other a roller coaster. The characters here, certainly you wouldn't want to call them disinterested, being able to take an objective view of the experience that they are having on the roller coaster. And if one looks in the literature on theme park and fairground rides and the psychology therein, I think there are some insights perhaps for the way we think about proprioceptive arts. So here we have just one quote, that one element of the best theme park fairground rides is the total immersion that such rides so often elicit. Just take the following description of a ride experienced by Conniff. A sharp wincing intake of breath, and the feeling of innards popping up like a parachute in one's rib cage. These are all proprioceptive, interoceptive stuff, very much foregrounded. My hair flew back and my eyes peeled wide and filled with tears, a product of the 60-mile-an-hour wind and also of self-pity. My teeth clenched and my knuckles locked bone-white around the lap bar. The train plunged into a short, hell-rattling tunnel, whipped around a sharp turn in the dark and roared up another hill. Scenery stuttered by like a film getting snagged in the gate of the projector. Everything veered out of control, and it was clear that I was about to die. Not disinterested evaluation of that proprioceptive experience or entertainment. And indeed, Holler himself notes that those who partake of one of his slide installations, that when they come down the slides, they have a sort of particular facial expression about them, and they're affected and they're to some degree changed by the experience. So perhaps hinting at this, it may be difficult to take the disinterested stance once our body is involved and it is thrown about in unpredictable ways. That said, if one takes a closer look at the mirror carousel, one of the things that's noted about it, irritates in fact some of the observers and some of the critics, is it's very slow. Speed, like the slide transitions. That the carousel doesn't go at the normal speed it would go on a fairground, perhaps for health and safety reasons, because it is in an art gallery. We need to think more about potential accidents and so on. And they describe it as the maddening slowness of the carousel. It turns, yes, it is in movement, but it's so slow that maybe that does sort of allow you to take this sort of disinterested stance about it. It's predictable movement, and it's very, very slow movement, and hence that might lead into this sort of discussion of relational aesthetics, in which much of Holler's work is grouped. But maybe here we need to be a little careful, because if you read the quotes about Holler and his work and what he's intending to do, then it's all part of the story is about sort of foregrounding that sort of subjective personal experience and contrasting it with the exhibits and illusions that he takes from the science or the psychology or neuroscience lab, where he claims that subjective personal experience in science is a no-no. Whereas here in my installations, slow down as they may be, it's all about your relation to the artwork. It's all about the subjective personal experience that is foregrounded through the proprioceptive and or other senses. But it's kind of ironic in a way, I think, when you look at some of his exhibits, with that notion that subjective judgment in science is a no-no, and then he comes out with his upside-down goggles, again lifted from the psychology labs, 1895, 1897 thereabouts. Psychologists were using these to study how quickly we could flip visual perception, wearing pseudophones to switch the ears around and seeing how quickly you could flip your hearing of left and right, wandering around the streets of Berlin, nearly being run over by carriages that you heard over there but actually came from the other side. And if you go back to any of these early papers, all they report is subjective experience. It's what's it like for those who are wearing the inverting glasses, the pseudophones that switch the ears. There's no objective measurement. It's all about subjective. So this is kind of a curious choice of an illusion. If one takes the Pinocchio Illusion, another one that where you vibrate that arm and it feels like your nose is getting really long. This together with the rubber hand illusion, where I stroke a hand and it feels like your hand is a rubber hand. You have an out-of-body experience. He hasn't turned that into an artwork yet, but both of those rely in the scientific papers that study them on subjective report. How strongly did you feel that that rubber hand was your hand? How long did you feel that your nose was? Subjective is centre stage, I admit. In some areas, we try to limit subjectivity, but it is key, and ironically key to a number of the exhibits that Holler has. So we've seen, and was mentioned already, I just sort of was busily typing in some of the proprioceptive works that were mentioned by Marcus. Put them all together, it feels like there is a movement, a thought, or at least increasing excitement around proprioceptive works of art in recent years from Holler, but then also from the various other artists here, and the one we will experience a little bit later on. So you might ask, well, what is it about now? Why has proprioceptive art, or maybe experiential art, become so popular in the contemporary era? And one might say it's something about growing interest in the body more generally as a subject of study and inquiry. Or maybe as a more cynical take, I wonder how much it's about the footfall and the experience that there's been a huge increase in various kinds of experiential art, things like the Tate Sensorium from 2015 for paintings from the collection where you could see a view of Sir Francis Bacon's Hyde Park while eating a chocolate specially created to match the painting with all its gritty smokiness while hearing a soundscape. Other works like John Latham's painting Full Stop to be experienced with a soundscape that sort of both echoed the size of the full stop and also the little dots at the side, while your hand was in a box feeling virtual or ultra haptics. You could feel your hand being touched without literally touching anything. And these kind of sensoriums, sensiplorations, immersive and experiential art, I think have grown in popularity precisely because more and more galleries are being judged and their funding so tightly linked to footfall that it's not sufficient anymore to provide a highbrow, sort of academically worthwhile exhibition, but you need to demonstrate boots on the ground. And for that, maybe it's just much easier to bring the punters in by presenting what you might call either entertainment, which is, isn't it, what you get when you take a fairground ride into an art gallery, or maybe edutainment. It's kind of mixing of educational and entertaining experience. And as the critics note, these experiential and proprioceptive art shows, things like Experience from Holler in 2011, are a great success with the public. Huge queues to get in. But they seem to fail with the critics, who aren't so sure that this push towards more people through the doors, greater audience numbers linked to increased funding, is really the way to go. So one nice article from Lindblad talking about the critics' response to Holler's Experience 2011 in New York, who notes that if we take the critics' evaluations as the guiding factor of whether or not Experience is a successful exhibition in a phenomenologically reflective sense, we can be sure it is not. Micah Pollock synthesizes the sentiment when she writes, "If the traditional work of art addresses the viewer as a thinking, aesthetically critical being, much of relational aesthetics, including this show from Holler, addresses the spectator in a more familiar mode, that of the consumer. Experience, from Holler, turns the museum into a funhouse, but at a cost. What we lose is the critical faculty, which in a way brings us full circle. Mr. Holler's is an exceptionally fun exhibition to visit, and a particularly difficult one to review. I would argue for a second look after the effects of the exhibition, nausea, headaches, bruises, salty ears from the flotation tank, etc., have worn off. Then maybe a focused reflection of the works is possible. The subjective individual experience is, in the end, up to the viewer, the rat in the laboratory, the scientist in the lab coat, or the visitor in the carnival, the connection back to the fairground or theme park. But so maybe we should be a little sceptical of the growing popularity of prop art if its purpose is primarily in terms of footfall and entertaining, rather than allowing for this more reflective aesthetic judgments. Probably my other main point to think about is really to say, does it make sense to think of proprioceptive art, or is all art, or at least proprioceptive art, really multisensory art? That it engages more senses. And here I think as a multisensory scientist, I know that I and my colleagues around the world, we study hearing, we study vision, we study touch, I study smell and taste, and the bodily senses are kind of ignored. We know there are lots of them, and we know they must interact, but proprioception, vestibular, kinesthetic is kind of at the sidelines of multisensory research conferences. So bodily senses are ignored by multisensory scientists, and yet I think proprioception and bodily sensation is fundamentally multisensory. As I mentioned, both integrating the bodily senses themselves, but also within the other more distal senses too. And maybe our response, our bodily experience in any situation is a function of all of those senses put together. So it's not really uniquely proprioceptive. Maybe I'm just sort of stressing what you'd call sort of the indirect effects from the Bridget Riley in a way. But I want to say we need to think about proprioception, be it in an art gallery, be it in the fairground, be it in the science lab, as a multisensory phenomenon engaging several, if not all, of the senses, bodily and otherwise. And this maybe can be reframed as stressing the sort of indirect effect, indirect proprioceptive art, as in staring at Bridget Riley, at your vision, that then is sort of inducing bodily sensations. But maybe I'm saying more that vision can modify bodily sensations rather than inducing them from nowhere. And we can take any sort of experience and say it's even the simplest of our perceptual experiences are fundamentally multisensory. That we can't even get a sense of a dot of light, which might seem like a purely visual phenomenon, without being able to integrate a retinal signal with proprioceptive and bodily signals to get a sort of stable position. Do we know if the light's moving or not? It's only as a result of integrating the senses that we get that sense of space. And similarly, some of the other sensations that you mentioned from the quote from Armitage Armstrong from 1962 about these interoceptive bodily sensations. Should we think about thermo art? That might seem like a purely interoceptive sense, and yet they're just like wherever one looks, our perception of either the temperature of ourselves or the temperature of the environment in which we find ourselves is significantly affected by the colour of the lighting, by the sound. And there's lots of work from Germany about trying to manipulate thermal comfort of airline passengers by changing the light in the cabin. You can't turn hot into cold, but you can get a degree or two of extra warmth and shift the thermal comfort levels simply by changing what one sees. So in this sense, probably any other proprioceptive bodily or internal sense one could show is actually the result of integration from multiple senses, or at least can be cross-modally influenced by the other senses. And then one might even think slightly jumping, but coming back to the question about the intentionality and the experience of the viewer in the proprioceptive element. How important is that? Is it enough that the author intended the bodily senses to be stimulated? Well, if we take another interoceptive signal like salivation, then one goes back to the 16th century, then there was a fashion, a trend amongst Dutch still life painters of fruits. They'd always have a sliced lemon on the table in the bowl of fruits. Why so? Well, the belief was the best artists could make their viewers salivate simply by seeing this cut lemon glistening, and that was why it was there. So in that sense, one would have to say Dutch still life painting is proprioceptive art, I guess. But until I went to an art conference and this was explained to me, I had no idea that I was supposed to salivate. I don't think I do salivate. An individual difference between people. Some, I imagine, do. So in this case, it just sort of doesn't feel right to include Dutch still life paintings as proprioceptive art, even though they fulfill lots of the criteria, unless you say, you know, it's important that the viewer or observer has the desired effect or knows what the desired effect was supposed to be, whether or not they actually experience it, perhaps. And if we take more specifically in the context of proprioceptive thrills and kinesthetic pleasures, the fairground, the theme park rides that Holler and others integrate into the art context, then clearly for this illusion, the haunted swing illusion, it only works as a result of the integration of your bodily movement with the visual signals telling you that you're actually upside down. It wouldn't be half as much fun, half as engaging, immersive, without the room swinging around you to give you that full illusion of a 360-degree tilt. And while it might be obvious that vision is going to be part of the story here in terms of proprioception and kinesthesis and bodily sensation, I think there's also a role for sound. And that's both the sound of the rides, but the sounds of the people on the rides, the sounds that surround the rides, seems in first-person sort of descriptions of what going to a theme park or a fairground is like. It's a truly multisensory experience, and it's not just about the proprioceptive experience on the dodgems, on the helter-skelter, or wherever. It's about the total multisensory experience. Here we have one suggestion here. Imagine entering a theme park where no music is playing, and the rides are not making their usual whooshing and clanging noises. Such an experience doesn't quite match up to our expectation of what the theme park should be. Sort of like watching an action movie on mute, or sitting in an empty restaurant where there's no din of fellow diners and no playing on the stereo. As the authors note, there is no more effective tool for shaping the mood in a space than sound. That sensations and sentiments are aroused by sound leads the authors to suggest that all themed spaces should include the power of sound, whether it be through a theme song, a special effect, or story-enhancing dialogue. Indeed, you know, some of those fairground rides, like Scream Zone at Luna Park, are kind of referenced in terms of the noise you hear, not in terms of the proprioceptive sensations you get. It's about the screams you hear of the others that somehow amplify the excitement or anticipation or unease. And then if you speak to the engineers behind the theme park rides, then they write, you know, there's a lot of psychology in the design of a good theme park. It's not just engineering, it's about human psychology of the senses. And as Russell Nye notes, though engineers are quite capable of designing relatively noiseless cars, they know that the sound of the ride is an integral part of it, and that the rattles, squeaks, and thunderous roar of the wheels impart a sense of speed and danger that adds immeasurably to the total effect. So here, kinesthesis, feeling of our body in motion, is not just a result of kinesthetic senses and bodily stimulation, it's also the sounds that we hear. And that sometimes sounds aren't there because they're necessary. On the contrary, sounds are sometimes intentionally placed within the environment because of the cognitive associations that they will invoke. The rattle, the wind of the machine itself, the screams of the others having that experience. And I think this is something, this sort of multisensory nature is something I'm sort of pursuing at the moment as I look back over the history of proprioceptive pleasures, kinesthetic thrills in the fairgrounds, It's sort of striking how often those who created these rides knew the power of the multisensory. And if one takes one other early fairground ride, the steam yachts, patented in 1888, just two swinging, a bit like the haunted swing, two swings going back and forth in counterpoint, that always steam yachts had an organ in the middle, between the two steam yachts, blasting out music. I think you cannot find a steam yacht, so a proprioceptive pleasure, involving the swinging of your body in space without the associated very loud music, as my father knows only too well as he's deaf now, but he grew up with his caravan next to the steam yacht in his fairground. You couldn't have one without the other. And as you look through other theme park rides and descriptions of the fairground, it's always that the music is there as part of the total multisensory experience. The proprioceptive, the bodily, may be foregrounded, but it's been modulated and enhanced, ratcheted up by sight, by vision, by mirrors, and by illusion. And then you can probably take it one stage further. Vision's important then to bodily sensation and experience. Sound is important. As Maguire notes, just imagine yourself embarking upon a trip to a theme park to experience some of those proprioceptive or bodily pleasures. As you enter, your senses are assailed by a plethora of stimuli. The rides are whirring, whizzing and clanging. The shrieks coming from the roller coaster complete with a buzz of excited conversation and shouting. Competing with country music loudly, the sun beating down, the other people bumping into you. It's all part of the proprioceptive experience, the total multisensory experience. As they run to join the line for the theme park's most frightening ride, and that can't be dissociated from the taste of the cotton candy, the milkshakes, the hot dogs if you're in the States. It's just this sort of total multisensory experience. It's all contributing to what you enjoy and your sense of pleasure. And some of that, I think, is kind of missed when these rides get taken into the art gallery context. They keep the proprioceptive and bodily elements. They may slow it down, but they eliminate all of the other multisensory cues, I think, that would be typically part of the experience. Now we have the smell of food and the distinct scent generated by the kinesthetics of a large crowd generates an olfactory character unique to the theme park. The sweat to go along with the screams of the others. Colours, lights, fellow patrons, and the chimeric architecture give your eyes an unlimited range of things to feast on. In this sensationally sensory experience, you are part of the action. No longer are you watching others experience the fantastical and the phantasmagorical of the silver screen. No longer are you going through the motions of the banality of diurnal life. You are a participant in this fantasy land, and your senses tell you that this is true, and it's all your senses that are doing the work here, contributing to sensory overload, if you will. Finally, beyond the multisensory element of proprioceptive pleasures, kinesthetics, thrills, I guess there's also sort of a historic element to things that are it's very sort of clear. And maybe this isn't unique to proprioception and bodily senses, but that our relationship to, our experience of, and our thoughts around proprioceptive stimulation have changed quite dramatically as the decades have gone by. And hence, if there were to have been proprioceptive art 100 years ago, the audiences would have had, I think, a very different response to it, because our response to proprioception generally was very different back then. And that sort of links into this, sort of the rise of what Sally Lynn talked about, sort of the shock of the modern and the rise of steam and electric power, of trains as captured here in Schimmelbusch's The Railway Journey. That if you go back to the first time that people went on a railway journey and felt the speed and the rapid transition of visual images through the window, doctors at the time were just horrified that this would be hugely mentally disturbing. This kind of shock as the carriages rumbled over the lines. This was a whole new kind of sensation for the public. The same thing maybe even from the invention of the what was called the vertical railway, or the elevator, again introduced in the US in the 1880s, but a complete failure. People just wouldn't ride on it. This idea, you know, sort of a rapid vertical movement is something, again, that kind of proprioceptive or bodily sensation had not been experienced before, and it was left people uneasy. And even something as mundane as a trip on a moving staircase, or what we today call an escalator. Here, the very first one from Harrods, a department store in London from 1898, was, you know, such an experience to behold. The customers would queue up to have a ride on the world's first moving staircase, and those behind us were so worried about, you know, the shock of this new kind of proprioceptive experience on the customers that it was smelling salts for the ladies and brandy for the men once you got off this ride to kind of calm your nerves. And that's, you know, almost inconceivable today that these simple sort of proprioceptive or bodily experiences would have generated such a strong reaction. And that's sort of, you know, that's sort of the shock of the modern then is partly what Sally Lynn writes about, who says it's probably not coincidental that theme park rides stimulating proprioceptive bodily senses, delivering kinesthetic thrills from the roller coaster and so on, that they came about at the same time as the general public was experiencing the shock of the modern, as railways were coming to transform transportation and deliver a whole new range of bodily sensations. This was, you know, sort of alien, frightening to people, and this was where the theme park ride sort of fitted in as an entertaining version, a controlled version of the new, the shock of the modern, and hence allowed people almost to sort of move more smoothly as these new sensations were introduced. That was then, 1900 or so, that theme park rides become more popular, stimulating the bodily and the other senses. Finally, one might think also about, it's not just in art that appears in the art gallery that proprioception has become more a focus of attention. One sees it also in the world of architecture, with bridges like this one, and this one. There's a whole glut of these sort of horrifying bridges in China, a number of which now have been closed because they're too dangerous, that do sort of foreground your proprioceptive sense through architecture. You feel your body, and maybe we'll have some of the same sensations in an hour or two this afternoon, I don't know. Yeah. But the idea that, you know, foregrounding proprioception of the body in architecture has also become more popular, not just in art. And that probably also links finally to the notion of play, I think. That I guess you can sort of stimulate any of the senses with or without a playful intent. But there seems to be a closer link between proprioception and play than the other senses. And if one takes something like this, put forward by Juhani Palaasma's, the seven sense architecture theorist from Finland, he talks about this sort of fountain in Portland, Oregon, as, you know, a sort of proprioceptive architecture, and points to the way that children play, jump around, they interact with this. So it really does engage the bodily senses, but in a playful manner. And that same thing, that sort of playful use of proprioception, is one that I think I also see as slides transition from the fairground to the Tate Modern and the art gallery, but then increasingly into the trendy, hip office workspaces of Shoreditch and elsewhere, and that even now the Google offices have a list of the best and the worst office slides. And this is all done in sort of a playful manner. I think it's bringing play back to the workplace, doing it through stimulating proprioception, through the fact that your face will be transformed when coming out of this slide, delivering this totally immersive experience that it's hard to take a disinterested stance on. So to conclude then, I'm not sure it's quite conclusion exactly,
it's 45
but this is a work in progress, as we were asked to do. I think, you know, I am uneasy, I guess, then about the taking of proprioceptive experiences from the lab and from the fairground, putting them in the art gallery, whether that is enough to call them proprioceptive art. I worry that a lot of the motivation for this comes from this kind of commercialization, trying to get footfall, focusing on the experience, maybe rather than the aesthetic response of audiences. And that, I wonder whether now there's a sense in which we also have kind of a new kind of shock of the modern, something around the metaverse and digital extended augmented reality. The technology, once again, is delivering a whole new sensory world, and yet all of all of those augmented and virtual technologies, they do a good job of stimulating our eyes and ears, but what they fundamentally fail to do, really, is stimulate our bodily senses. And as such, I sort of wonder whether there's a role for the fairground ride, the prop art slide, as sort of focusing on this important sensation, but one which cannot be captured by the technology. And with that, I think I shall leave it.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot for your talk. So there's a quarter of an hour left for questions, and let me take the position up here so that I can also follow the chat. And I have to orient myself first where the questions start. Okay, excellent. So, questions in the room first. Isabel. Oh yeah, the microphone. Where's the sponge, our magic sponge with the microphone? Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting, and I gotta say, I feel a lot of it. Like, I agree with a lot of what you said. And I also, I agree with the kind of critical idea of, is this just a trick to get people into the museum? Is this kind of just taking ideas which were already there in fairgrounds, in the labs, and like just using them for something else? But I was wondering whether we could like find a positive spin on it by using a historical analogy, if you want to call it like that. So think of Duchamp's fountain, which I think all of you probably know it. Duchamp took a urinal and put it in an art gallery and called it art, and it is art now. And it is basically something which had a function somewhere else and which we know from somewhere else, and now we experience it differently because we meet it in a different context. And so one of my hopes for proprioceptive artworks, or what we're talking about, the artworks we're talking about here, is that just by being or by interacting with them in a different context, we might experience them differently. And I was wondering, what do you think about that?
Well, I haven't been to any of these proprioceptive artworks nor slid down the slide at Tate Modern when it was there, so I can't give a first-person perspective. But some of those quotes from the North American art critics, would be that at least on your first exposure to Holler's experience with the slides and the flotation tanks and the Pinocchio nose and the upside-down goggles, your audiences are queuing out of the door. Yes, so it's successful, but you're caught in the moment and you can't take that other perspective. You're sort of captured by the bodily sensations and the enjoyment. And I guess their best hope is to say, well, maybe the second time you go back, you might be able to get something more from it. But maybe, So maybe it is that the pleasure in the experience itself that sort of distracts in a way that was not the case for the urinal. It has no intrinsic pleasure or way of engaging you. So maybe you're left only with the question of why is it here and is that right? Whereas maybe the entertainment problem, especially if it's a bodily entertainment, is maybe so strong and so engaging or immersive or overpowering that the other more distance or aesthetic response is much harder to get.
Yeah, Xenia first. And then
Thank you so
Corinna.
much. It was really interesting. I'd like to ask about your perspective as an experimental psychologist. And perhaps you could give us a sense of the methodologies you have within your field. Because as I imagine, so in sciences like experimental psychology, controlling an experiment is very important, right? And in case of such experiences like hurlers and others, so it's quite hard, right? To well, it's important to observe them, right? You can of course go through surveys and get to people's subjective self-reflections. But what else is there in terms of the methods that you use?
So I think it's certainly true and a growing awareness that the data and the experiments that the psychologists and neuroscientists do tend to be on what's come to be called weird populations of Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic boys and girls studying psychology. Sort of in North America is 95% of all data points we have about experience. So in that sense it's growing awareness that it's restricted, limited, and also that the fact of being in a science lab changes the experience. And we have sort of thought sometimes about discussions with various artists about trying to do things in one space or the other. And as I was asking Marcus last night, where is this meeting being held today? Because that's part of setting the context, and we might interact differently if we were in a psychology building or in somewhere else. So I think there's a great awareness of that sort of contextual thing that's been ignored in the past. You can just assume if I control all the variables, then one way to do that may be to do more ecologically valid research. And so I didn't have time to mention it, but I mean, one of the challenges is those steam yachts that blast out the music at 100 decibels. I'm not allowed to present sound to you at 100 decibels. It's damaging your hearing. So I cannot recreate the environment in the lab for health and safety reasons. A little bit ironic. But some research just came out from the States, actually took physiological responses and behavioural questionnaires from groups going through a theme park, a haunted house. So they had groups of, then you're actually collecting data in a more, you can collect data sometimes in a sort of valid environment, and that's starting to become slightly more common, obviously hard to do, but... Biofeedback methods, right? By what? Biofeedback? Yep. Essentially, and I guess more working obviously in concert halls and such. And one of my favourite ones from there's something about the shared experience, again, which is sort of, and so in the theme park, in this sort of haunted house study with biophysical measures, then they also checked, the relationship between the groups of people in each room. Do you know each other, and how does that modulate your experience of fear and nausea and whatever else? But in the context of, in the science lab, it's always, there's only just one subject normally. You're not in a group. You're isolated. You're sitting still. You don't have any of these other cues of music, the smells. So a bit like the art gallery, it's limited in that sense. And that sort of shared experience element is sort of captured again by this German study where they actually took all the air pre-COVID out of the cinema as people watched thousands and thousands of people watching different kinds of films, and they could pick up sort of this sort of social chemical signal in the outflow of the air, and arguing that's part of the shared experience and why you enjoy seeing things or experiencing things in a group. You have the sort of shared chemical signal. And so,
Okay. I've got two questions in the chat. First by Benjamin.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. So I wanted to come back to the question to the problem of the privateness of proprioceptive art that was raised by Marcus. And I wanted to ask what psychology can tell us on this matter. So how can psychology and experimental psychology
I suppose in a way, yeah, I wasn't sure I entirely agreed. I do have a sense of other people's state of mind, of their internal sensations. And if I can't sense it with my own senses, I guess I can also stick monitors on you and check your blood flow and heart rate and skin conductance. And from that, get a much better sense of, check voice patterns, and from that get a sense of internal state. And I think if you take the case, those people screaming on the roller coaster, I think I know exactly what their internal state is like, but not because I share that proprioceptive experience, but I can infer it from what I hear and what I see, and that maybe, those don't really want to introduce mirror neurons, but if one is of that persuasion likes mirror neurons, then maybe you do sort of share the experience, you mirror in some sense some part of the experience of others. So maybe it's harder to access another's proprioceptive state. I don't think it's impossible to do so. And if you can't access it necessarily, you can infer or imagine.
Yeah.
You can put yourself in the place of others to a degree.
Right.
So it's like an analogic inference.
Okay.
Probably, unless it's mirror neurons, then it's not an inference. But yeah, I would think so too. Yeah. It's at least not directly perceived. I have another question on the chat, so I'd like to go for this one first, Corinna, and then your question. Ludger is next.
Hello, everyone. Many thanks, Charles, for this talk, and especially for highlighting that proprioception is in the center of the fairgrounds and theme parks and roller coasters, etc. So there's a lot of aesthetic experience already there. One might ask, also in addition to what Marcus has developed earlier, in which way this aesthetic experience is constituted for something to be a proprioceptive art. You said in the beginning of the talk that proprioception had to be intentionally foregrounded in the viewer's experience for it to be an artwork. And I wonder what this foregroundedness could imply, or how we would spell this out. Now in the discussion, already answering the earlier question, there were two options, I think, at play. One was that proprioception in that work is just irrelevant, put to the foreground. So clearly, when in the Tate Gallery or in the Museum of Modern Art, it's put to the foreground, but it's not necessary, or it's not really what the work as a work of art focuses on. So it is essential. It's essentially there, just like in the fairground, but it's just not about it. So it's not relevant for its character as an artwork. Or the other option would be that transferring it from, say, the fairground to the art space would, as in the urinal case, infer a different experience. So you experience it differently with a different setting. But the third option would be that this kind of work creates or evokes or foregrounds other proprioceptions than the sensational ones that it works with, you see? So there could be a third option that just by highlighting the sensation one, but also in a way criticizing it, already by the different institutional framework, would mean that other proprioceptions are inferred or provoked. Maybe that's the fourth option, but I would like to ask you what kind of proprioception is foregrounded or in the artwork if other non-art works already include
So on the one hand, I'd imagine it's to say that proprioceptive or bodily senses are foregrounded is that they are attended, so you're conscious of them in the way that, I guess now we're never conscious of the clothes on our body or the chair we're sitting on until we think about it. And then in that act of thinking about it or attending to our body, suddenly I am aware of the clothes and my contact with the world. So that sort of attention, focusing your attention on this sense, which is normally neglected or is normally in the background because we're visually dominant. That's one kind of foregrounding. And then you say, well, maybe there's another, that's not enough, or that isn't always all that's going on. By foregrounding it in this context, you're hoping that the audience or the participant will take a kind of almost an external perspective on this sensation that is foregrounded in my attention, my awareness. What is that about? Why? But for that, maybe that might be something you can do if the mirror carousel is going so slowly it's hardly moving at all. But something you can't do for a faster paced ride where maybe you can't have this aesthetic response to it because you can't be disinterested because you're just in the moment and it's so completely immersive that it's impossible to take any other stance than the foreground of your bodily senses in the moment and how you're about to die. In a second sense, that in the mirror carousel, but I suspect not the slide, the bodily sensations might be so toned down and gentle and slow that you can take this disinterested perspective in those bodily sensations, and because of the context, think, why am I experiencing them here and what do I feel about them here rather than elsewhere? So again, so foregrounded in a more contemplative way.
We do have further questions, and we have run out of time already, but since this is the last talk for today, I would like to allow the 3 further questions I have in the chat. I have 2, but Corinna in the audience first, and then Robin and Katrin from the chat.
Okay, thank you first of all for the interesting presentation in this ride through history with all the fairground attractions. I think my question fits to Isabel's and Xenia's. So I'm also an empirical psychologist. I work in empirical aesthetics, and when you showed the carousel on the fairground and then the carousel in the art gallery, I immediately thought about how to test how aesthetic experience differs between the fairground setting and the gallery setting, because for visual art, as Isabel mentioned, there's a lot of studies on how contexts differ, like how aesthetic experience differs for context. And there's, like, context makes a difference, but for paintings there's also this Fescue smile accommodation, so we can actually oversee that it's a reproduction, and we can also then like see the reproduction on the screen as if it's art, so we can, see over this, and this has been done for visual art, and I think this is maybe not so much possible for proprioceptive art or performance art. Actually in my lab in Vienna we are planning a study where we replicate the performance by Marina Abramovich. The artist is present in the lab, and then also in the gallery context to see whether there's a difference in the experience. Yeah, and I was wondering whether you would think that is interesting, or what you would expect, if you have thought about this yourself as an experimental psychologist.
I suppose I have come out of a few European-ish projects over the last couple of decades with sort of art curators and art historians and aestheticians and scientists on the other side. And it's often cropped up, we've been put in grant proposals to study people's response, particularly to objects in the lab versus in the art gallery, the same objects. If you can get them out of the gallery into the lab on loan, which isn't necessarily so easy, and I do believe that context will have a profound effect. And you're right, you could do exactly the same kind of context manipulation experimentally for some of these slides or carousels in one context or another, and see what happens, and should be done, I suppose.
Question that comes with it would be how to measure this.
And also the fact that you say, okay, I can take groups of people, I can find a suitably small proprioceptive artwork that will fit in a gallery, but also is congruent in a in an entertainment space, take groups into both environments and see how they respond and what they think. But I think you will not be able to capture in the gallery the 100 decibels of music, the smell of the cotton candy, the other sweaty bodies. So how much is that? Is it the place in which it's presented that's doing the work, or that changes the response, or all these other sensations that maybe you can't easily reproduce in an art space?
Yeah, you have to probably start somewhere and reduce the experience to some aspects of it. Okay, thank you.
Right, good. We have 2 questions, as I said, from the chat. Robin first, please.
Thanks very much for the presentation, and thanks also to Luca for posing a question I found really thought-provoking with regards to this collection of material, particularly because I think one of the things that Carsten Bühler's work does is highlight a particular cultural phenomenon. In other words, like certain popular forms of entertainment. And I wonder if the presentation of these forms in the gallery is not actually not inviting participation, but observation and ridicule in a way. In other words, it's as Luca was suggesting, a commentary, and as such is a lot more semiotic than it is really proprioceptive. And I wonder if there are better examples, ones that aren't making explicit reference to the fun fair and to the traditions of the fun fair. Others that ask you to participate with your body, and there's absolutely no other way to participate. This is exactly what Luca was saying really, but I'm thinking about, light art, a whole range of other arts of the 20th century that actually demand corporeal involvement and aren't possible to partake of in any other fashion, but don't allow you to separate yourself from the idiots who are, involved. In other words, I feel like the slides and the roundabout invite you to step back and separate yourself from corporeal involvement in a way that other objects can't permit. In other words, once you are observing them, you are involved. There's no way of avoiding them. That would be my question.
So I wonder whether there are, might say, theme park and fairground inspired rides in art context are a special case of proprioceptive stuff, and there are others that don't reference other aspects of culture or don't have another environment in which you've come across them before, and they may be importantly different, and yet I guess from that Lindblad piece, I think of Holler saying, of course, those who are sliding down the slide, those who are on the merry-go-round, they are experiencing directly proprioception, but the slides are transparent so that the audience waiting in the queue or just passing through the turbine hall are also part, or so they're not able, in a way, to detach from it. It's, in some sense.
But if the search was for some more pure proprioceptive art, then we could look at choreographies. That might be dance or yoga or martial art choreographies. If they are centered in an art context, then you cannot possibly perceive the artwork or engage with the artwork unless you have these proprioceptions. They are really at center stage. While the installations, you can always ignore them or ignore the proprioception and only visually look at them, etc. But for a realization of a choreography, be that dance or yoga, etc., you must engage your body, and then you would have a purer proprioception in these cases. If that was the one target of the question, whether we could have that kind, and yeah.
Although presumably there are a few rare individuals without proprioception.
Of course, yeah, but again, it's
choreography
Yeah, but it's always the question whether that's accidental. Of course, as embodied creatures, we always proprioceptive, we can't help it. But is it an essential part of the artwork or not? That would be important. I do have further questions here. I can only take one further one by Katrin, please, in the chat. And then Peter has a long comment. Thanks, Peter, for that. I can't focus on that. I'm afraid, because we are running out of time and have to go to the museum, at least those of us who are in the room here. But Katrin, your question, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the talks. It's very, very interesting. I apologize if my question maybe is something all the other more knowledgeable listeners already know, but I have some trouble with the term of disinterest, because I feel if we are talking about intentions of the artist and the viewer, the disinterested part poses a problem for me, because as soon as I am willing to engage in especially proprioceptive art, I feel that part is taken away, but maybe it's a complete misunderstanding of the term on my part. I apologize again if I'm not as knowledgeable in this.
So I'd maybe take it rightly or wrongly to imply that you can make some evaluation without a bodily consequence, or in the absence of desire or feeling an abstract judgment about something, as it is, not because of how it affects you, or so of the Mona Lisa I can say it's beautiful or not, without any reference to particular feeling or desire. It's a rate in itself, whereas in other cases like food, the argument or the ride would be, I cannot kind of concentrate on the thing without, my judgment's always going to be coloured by my experience or my desire for, in one case, the food on the plate, or on the case of the ride, I cannot switch off that total immersion.
So, thanks for maybe I can offer a thought here. Thanks for this question. I thought about this when you mentioned the disinterested part of aesthetics, and I mean it comes from, or it can be seen in romantic paintings. Consider some Caspar David Friedrich, the iceberg, or whatever it's called. When we look at it, we can be disinterested and still have this feeling of awe. Disinterested because in the sense of we are in no danger. We see the danger of the ice, of the isolation, of the coldness, of the sharp edges of the ice, but we are in no danger. And this is why we can be disinterested or step back. We are not affected in a physical sense. And that is not possible for proprioceptive art. However, this quote you had where the person said, and I felt I was going to die, or I surely go, that's not the case, actually. I mean, that was an exaggeration by the writer, and I see where this exaggeration is coming from. But we are going on these rides being sure that nothing is going to happen to us. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it, or many of us wouldn't do it. So even the fairground rides are disinterested in the sense of we sure know, or at least we assume, that we are not going to die, that this machine is working, it's safe. And so I think the disinterested part can also be in proprioception as well, because it's a safe environment and not really free climbing or some other kind of activity which really puts you in danger or your life in danger. So it's possible to have disinterested proprioceptions.
I agree with the sentiment that it feels like you're going to die.
I know it feels like, but you're sure you're not. Otherwise, you wouldn't take the ride. Most of us wouldn't take the ride.
But whether it's the knowing or the feeling, that's key in that case.
But that's the same with the what's the painting called by Friedrich Eismeer in German? I don't know the German, the English word. But that's the feeling there. I mean, I see the danger, I see the coldness, I see the sharp edges, etc. But I know I'm safe. I go on the roller coaster, it feels like I'm going to die, but I know I won't. So I think there's a perfect parallel here.
But I feel cold looking at the iceberg.
Yeah, okay, sure, yeah, I see what you mean, yeah. It is somehow closer. It is closer. As with food, if we are hungry, can you really have a disinterested meal? That's
I think so, maybe the analogy with the rubber hand illusion, where again you have these questions. I know that the rubber hand on the table is not my own hand,
but still
it feels like me, and I will, if I then stab the rubber hand, you will sweat.
Yeah, of course, take.
So I know it's not, but that sort of sense of feeling or embodiment feels different from just watching a hand being stabbed on a movie or something, or in a painting.
Right. Good. We must go and proprioceive now at the museum, so we ought to stop here now. Charles, thanks again for your great talk. And thanks everyone on Zoom online. Sorry that you can't participate now when we go to the museum and into the net. We might, in our open discussion tomorrow, we might report our proprioceptions to you tomorrow. See you tomorrow. We start at 10, is that right? Yeah, okay. We start at 10 tomorrow for everyone, and we go to the museum. Bye, see you tomorrow.